Bonjour tout le monde. Hello everyone. Je suis extrêmement heureux de vous accueillir aujourd'hui pour une nouvelle conférence virtuelle du CDTS. I'm delighted to welcome you for a new CLTS virtual talk. For those who don't know me, my name is Florian Martin Barito. I am an associate professor of law and the University Research Chair in Technology and Society at the University of Ottawa, where I notably lead the university's Center for Law, Technology and Society. And although today we are hosting a virtual event, I would like to start our event by an indigenous affirmation, as I am presently located on unsurrendered traditional Algonquin territory. And as one of its uninvited visitors, I benefit every day from my continued presence on this territory and conversation with indigenous identifying friends and students. And as such, I want to pay respect to the Algonquin people, who are the traditional guardians of this land, and I acknowledge their long-standing relationship with this territory, which remains unceded. Je rends également hommage à tous les peuples autochtones, qu'ils soient de la région ou d'ailleurs, au Canada ou à travers le monde. Et je reconnais les gardiens des savoirs traditionnels, jeunes et âgés. Today's virtual event is co-presented with the Global Innovation Journalist Lab, a SHORK-funded partnership grant led by Alf Hermida and Marilyn Young at the University of British Columbia. And today we have the pleasure to be joined by several researchers of this partnership grant and launch a first report titled From Flies to File Storage, Policy Issues in the Life Cycle of Explanatory Journalism. That is the result of the research led by our group in regarding the exploration of policy impact of explanatory journalism. And in a few minutes, you will hear from the co-authors, Heidi Tworek, Sabrina Wilkinson, and Elizabeth Dubois. But beyond the report's authors, we also have the pleasure to be joined by Evangeline Sadler today. Evangeline Sadler is the deputy editor of Policy Options, the IRPP's online policy forum. She's a veteran editor with more than 2 decades of experience at the Montreal Gazette, where she started on the news desk and moved through the newsroom. And as national editor, she oversaw federal and provincial political coverage with reporters in Quebec City and Ottawa bureaus. And Evangeline will act as our event moderator, but I'm sure she will also be able to bring a professional perspective on explanatory journalism to the conversation and policy, especially with the amazing work that our team has been doing with policy option. And so without further ado, I will hand the virtual mic to Evangeline, and I will leave you introduce the speakers. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Florian. Can everybody hear me? Okay, great. So thanks everybody for tuning in to talk about this topic. It's a topic that affects all of us, whether it's as consumers of news or generators of information or makers of policy. What we mean by explanatory journalism is essentially news and opinion writing that has more context than traditional reporting. It's really meant to bring people up to speed on a given topic, and it breaks down specialized terms and concepts, really drills down to the hows and whys, and it allows people who are less familiar with a topic to really get a grip on it. So, of course, we know journalists produce a lot of explanatory journalism, but so do academic scholars. And today, that's the kind of explanatory journalism that we're going to be talking about that has a policy focus and is written by academics. This is the kind of writing that appears in news media on opinion pages, and it also appears in publications like The Conversation and Policy Options, which is where I work. And we publish every day on a variety of topics, and our op-eds run about 1,200 words, which is a lot shorter than traditional academic writing and reports. So we have a standing invitation for people to submit, and we also reach out to particular authors when we're putting together series that we want to use to explore certain topics. We do, and we sort of pick and choose from the submissions that come in. We do look for pieces that are, that will offer someone who can write an analysis that's based on news events or government decisions or the plans that government has. But we do also recognize that it's unfamiliar territory for a lot of authors. So we offer guidance on how to write an op-ed. We have a section on our website that really sort of spells out what we look for in an op-ed and how to go about writing one. We also demystify our copy editing process. We actually recently put together an FAQ document because we found a lot of authors sort of wondered about the same things. So we share that with authors once we've accepted a piece, and that sort of answers a lot of questions that people have, because we do understand it's a new avenue for a lot of people. So explanatory journalism, it's important. Why should we care what happens with it? This is all part of the reasons why we're here today to talk about it. We know that the internet has opened the floodgates to more voices than ever. We're awash in information, and of course, not all of it is good. The media is in deep decline. We've got rising fake news. We've got disinformation, polarization. All of it is bad for democracy. And so this is where evidence-based journalism can really come in and play a role. It can help policymakers who are, let's face it, they're busy, they're stressed, they're human. They need to find good information that's evidence-based. They need to be able to find it easily. And once they find it, they need to be able to digest it easily. The broader public doesn't always follow issues very closely, although we want them to be informed voters. We want them to be, supporting good policy. So this kind of writing can find their way to the broader public more easily, because, a lot of the academic reports are so valuable, we just don't see them. They're not available outside the academic community. So explanatory journalism that's evidence-based can really cut through the noise of all of the stuff that's floating around out there that maybe is not very well supported or actively wrong. At Policy Options, we see how it can help to mobilize knowledge and shape policy. We've had authors be contacted by federal ministers to set meetings to discuss the articles in what they've written. We've seen new policy be changed to reflect those ideas. A series we did on sexualized violence was cited in discussions of Bill C3. We've had policy option pieces mentioned in House of Commons committees and Government of Canada reports, and authors have been invited to speak to government departments. So there is an important role for that kind of explanatory journalism that we publish, and that is part of the news and policy ecosystem. However, we do know that because a lot of these pieces now live online and they live for a long time, there are a lot of issues and considerations. And so that's what we're going to be talking about today, is some of those challenges and considerations. So before we get into it, I'm just going to give you a rundown of what the hour is going to look like. Heidi Tworek is the lead author of the report, and she's going to first offer a short overview of it. She'll give the summary, but we encourage you to download the full report. The link should be pasted in the chat by now, and after that, I'll moderate a decision with Heidi and two of her co-authors, Sabrina Wilkinson and Elizabeth Dubois. And then we'll open it up to the audience, and you can type in your questions and put them in the chat at any point. We do have someone who will be moderating for us in the comments and collected them and organizing them. All right, so let's hand it over to Heidi, who is an associate professor at the University of British Columbia. Heidi.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Evangeline. And I am speaking to you from unceded Musqueam territory, which is where UBC is located. So as Evangeline said, I'm the lead author on this report, but really it is absolutely a team effort that is multidisciplinary with multilingual research. So there are three of us who are presenting today, myself, Elizabeth Dubois, and Sabrina Wilkinson, but there are also two other co-authors who I believe are also here today, Elizabeth Wren and Louisa Lee, who are just as important and essential to this report as the three of us on this call. So it's been a deep pleasure to work together with these other four to put together this report. And a lot of what we were doing is really reaching into multiple disciplines, law, history, communications and media studies, and policy to produce a much broader sense of what is explanatory journalism, but also how does it fit into a broader life cycle. So often when we talk about a piece of journalism, of course, we focus on specific aspects, whether it is who is authoring it, how it is produced within the newsroom, and perhaps the comments or its distribution. And what we wanted to do with this report is to place explanatory journalism into a much broader, what we ended up calling life cycle. So to really understand much broader structural factors that influenced whether academics wanted to write these types of pieces in the first place. Everything from the incentives within our promotion and tenure structures to write this sort of type of piece rather than, say, a peer-reviewed article, all the way through to what are the sorts of issues around intellectual property rights in news, what are the issues around payment for media outlets that may or may not push them towards this type of journalism, and then through to the actual potential policy impacts, whether that is the discoverability of these types of pieces because of how something like Google News delivers news through its algorithms, all the way through to something that has, at least in the past, been an issue, which is the afterlife of such pieces, how they're stored, do the links to them rot, and what potentially happens when we move into new formats. So what we did in this report is we took a whole variety of different, as I said, disciplinary approaches to really try and sketch out this much broader life cycle of where we get from when a piece is being created, who is writing it and why, all the way through to how it is produced and why, and its afterlife. And we particularly looked at this through the lens of policy impact, which is one of the streams of the broader SSHRC grant, which is look at global journalism innovation. And the team at University of Ottawa is particularly interested in looking at the policy impact of explanatory journalism. So we spent a lot of time thinking about what are the potential policy impacts, who is able to make it into those spheres, and looking a little bit at the point that Evangeline made of who is actually getting cited in the House of Commons, and is that because of the explanatory journalism that they are writing. So we took a variety of approaches to get at this. One, as I've said, is to look at who's getting cited in the House of Commons, what is happening with some of these explanatory journalism pieces. We also looked at what have been the various legal cases around questions like intellectual property rights in news. And we also took a broader international view on what are some of the issues that have been raised in other countries, whether it is intellectual property rights in news in places like Germany, what is happening with translation rights in China, what is happening with deals to pay news outlets because their media appears on social media, which has been a big debate in Australia. So what we tried to do was take both a deep dive in different disciplines and look at what is happening in multiple countries, and then try and think about how that has impact within Canada. And so in the report, you'll see we go through what we've called the life cycle of explanatory journalism, giving a sense of what are the challenges at different stages, what are the potential incentives for academic authors, media outlets, and policymakers, how can we try to address some of those challenges. And then, of course, this being a policy report, we end with some recommendations. Even though this is about journalism that's appearing online, we actually don't offer a lot of recommendations to social media platforms. That's been widely discussed. So we thought this is a report where we can actually offer recommendations to 4 different sets of people who don't necessarily often get recommendations directed at them. So we give some recommendations for academic authors. How can they think about pushing for changes, for example, within their universities to change incentive structures to recognize this type of work, which can often have, if we're thinking about policy impact, much more impact than some of the peer-reviewed materials on which this explanatory journalism is often based. Secondly, we offer a whole host of recommendations to universities, including thinking about setting up offices that can deal with the sort of harassment that often may come particularly to women or people of color who may be engaging in this type of journalism. And so if we want to, again, improve the incentives for people to be engaged in explanatory journalism, we need to think about these broader reasons why people might not want to participate or feel that they need greater support to do so. We also offer some suggestions for outlets themselves, including looking out for issues that we discovered, like bad translations, and making sure that their journalism isn't being translated in problematic ways. And then finally, we give some recommendations for policymakers, including thinking about how they themselves actually look for explanatory journalism and raising their awareness that simply using Google News may not be the best way to discover all of the excellent explanatory journalism that exists. So to sum up, this is really an interdisciplinary effort to trace out a life cycle of explanatory journalism, to look beyond the product itself, to see what are the many structures that actually lead to the production, distribution, and assessment of this type of journalism, which I would add is extremely important and urgent at this moment when we're facing so many multiple overlapping crises that need to be explained in accessible ways to a broad public, whether it's climate change or the pandemic. This type of journalism has the potential to make real impact in how a broader public and policymakers understand what is going on and actually integrate the latest scholarship. So with that, I'll hand back to Evangeline for a bit more of discussion.
Great. Thanks a lot, Heidi. Now we're going to bring in Sabrina Wilkinson and Elizabeth Dubois into the conversation. Sabrina is a researcher at Equal Voice, a multi-partisan organization that is dedicated to electing women to all levels of political office. And Elizabeth is an associate professor at the University of Ottawa and a faculty member at the Center for Law, Technology, and Society. So, Sabrina, why don't we start with you? What does explanatory journalism offer to policymakers that's different from other types of policy contributions?
First, yeah, thank you to all of the 4 co-authors who are on this call. Yeah, we all had a great time writing this report, and it's nice to be able to close it with this event. But yeah, with respect to what explanatory journalism can offer to policymakers that's different from other types of policy contributions, I think the 2 key contributions that first come to mind are brevity and accessibility. So to begin, of course, there are a wide variety of ways that individuals can contribute to the policy development process. There are policy reports like the one that we're talking about today. There are pieces of explanatory journalism, of course, and there are also contributions that might be specific to particular calls from government consultations. And of course, all of these different contributions offer a lot to the policy development process, and some are more or less appropriate in a given context. But where, again, I think explanatory journalism really provides, offers something a bit new and different to these conversations that have been going on for a long time, is the length as well as the accessibility of the content. So when we're talking about, let's say, a policy report like this one, for instance, which is again serves a very important function, and which is, it fits exactly for the given purpose of what we're talking about today. But this document is by its very nature lengthier and takes longer to absorb than a piece of explanatory journalism, right? I think, Evangeline, you referenced that a policy options, a piece might be 1,200 words. I think at the conversation, don't quote me on this, but they're quite a bit shorter, right? They might even be 700 to 800 words.
Yeah.
And when we're talking about policymakers, these are individuals who are extremely pressed for time. They have many, many different competing priorities. They have a range of different responsibilities. And oftentimes it will be that short, accessible, brief piece of content that their staffer hands to them that can, make a difference or can bring an issue to the fore or to the forefront of the policy discussion. So this is, kind of that point around brevity. And with respect to accessibility, I think I feel very strongly that, well, and I'm sure many of us do here, that the people who should be involved in public policy making are those who are impacted by the policies that are being made. So I think when, we look at explanatory journalism's key goals of providing, context, making this content accessible to a mainstream audience, these are key things that can be achieved through this mechanism, and which can in turn, hopefully kind of galvanize and engage members of the public in these often very kind of complex policy issues.
Right. So the question of discoverability is something that that we should talk about too. It's often controlled. Well, in large part, it is controlled by the algorithms of Google, Facebook, and Twitter. And we know, we've been watching, the testimony by the former Facebook employees have shown just exactly how much control over information the big tech companies actually have. Elizabeth, I'll ask you, what does that mean for policymakers who are looking for information and experts?
Yeah, I think discoverability is so essential when we're thinking about how information can move from experts, and in this case, we're talking a lot about academics, to policymakers to get that done. And Sabrina's talked a little bit about, a staffer giving somebody the short piece. But that staffer has to find it somewhere. So discoverability is essentially just how easy or difficult is it to find content via online tools like search engines, websites, applications. And when these companies like Google and Facebook and Twitter and other tech giants have as a core purpose in our daily lives to organize and filter information for us, they clearly play an important role in how that staffer or that policymaker is going to end up getting information. And so we could look to examples like, Google News having agreements to prioritize the visibility of certain pieces of content in exchange for subscriber data from outlets. Or Facebook making a decision at one point, they were prioritizing video content. And so a bunch of news outlets were starting to create more video content along with their explanatory journalism pieces or other kinds of pieces. And so then the way that the information is even shaped and crafted to be made available changes in relation to the choices these tech companies are making. It also means that policymakers and their staff, just like everyone else, need this level of digital and media literacy to understand why something is discoverable and why something isn't, and to be able to make a note for, okay, just because this was easy for me to find doesn't mean it's the best or the only or the most crucial information. And so there's a level here that, we talk about in this report of not only recognizing discoverability matters, but also developing tools and tactics for finding information that's maybe not as kind of first click and top of mind.
Right. Discoverability is really like a buzzword that's really only now starting to be talked about by publications that are, trying to figure out, who can see, how they can, surface their articles to the top of the search engine results. So if publications are only now just sort of starting to understand it, imagine like policymakers, it's an even bigger stretch for them to even start to think, well, now I have to care about discoverability.
Yeah, and I would just add that the idea of like search engine optimization has been around for a while, and I think there's a decent level of understanding about what that is, although the nitty-gritty is still a little bit black box and unknown. But I think that Fenwick McKelvey and Robert Hunt, who have McKelvey's at Concordia, they have a great piece on discoverability, and they break it down so it's explained as not just about optimizing for a particular algorithm, but understanding the ways that people are interacting with these communication tools and these media systems. And so for anybody who's like, oh, now I have to worry about discoverability, where do I even start? I would say McKelvey and Hunt is a really great place to start on that.
Great.
And our report too.
But yes, that too. Sabrina, I'll move to you the question about large news organizations and how around the world they are starting to try to get Google and Facebook to negotiate with them to pay for using their content, which you can understand is a logical desire for companies that are strapped for cash. But what are some of the unintended consequences the pursuit of these negotiations can have on the smaller news outlets and the publishers that publish explanatory journalism?
Yeah, so I think perhaps the key consequence that comes to mind here, the key risk around these sorts of negotiations, is the risk that smaller news outlets, many of which are are, you know, those that are publishing explanatory journalism are left out of these conversations. So when we look at, you know, the negotiations that Facebook and Google have had with publishers in Australia recently, I believe it was the conversation in Australia was literally, you know, not even ignored, but I think their request to negotiate with Facebook was actually declined. So in some cases too, it's like, are these unintended or intended consequences as well? And then there are many other examples in Australia of other, you know, smaller news outlets who have not been able to make contact, have not been able to actually even start these negotiations in the first place. So I think there are a lot of questions there around, you know, what voices are being prioritized, what news outlets are being prioritized, and which ones are kind of being left out, because as we know, Google and Facebook play very important roles in sort of channeling the journalism that many people read. And even in Canada, right, there is Facebook announced, I think it's called a news innovation test, so sort of this experiment they're doing where they're paying 14, and I think now it's 17 different news outlets for their content. And again, there are questions to be raised about, you know, how those 17 were selected, which sort of publications are able to kind of engage in these practices, which ones of them are not. And I think more often than not, it again is those publications that are smaller, might have alternative business models, might be digital first, et cetera, that may be, you know, unintentionally or intentionally excluded from these conversations. So that's definitely kind of the key consequence that comes to mind for me.
Right, thanks. So I'll move to Elizabeth for the next question. In policymaking, we talk about the space inside the circle and the space outside it. And scholars with a high profile they tend to be turned to more often for their input into in policy committees to testify, for example, before House of Commons and Senate committees. What are some of the factors that make it harder for academics that are outside the circle to participate in policy?
You know, this is a great question, and it's one that I think is broader than just explanatory journalism, but definitely has an impact here. And so one part of it is, yeah, these people who are choosing which academics to call on, whether it's to do briefings or to be experts in front of House of Commons committees or Senate committees, or whatever else it might be, they're pressed for time. They have limited resources. They are going to be grabbing whoever they know for sure can speak to something. And so that is whoever they most recently heard. And we know that people who are not men and not white are less likely to be called on to be on the evening news. They're less likely to be called on to be writing these explanatory pieces because they're more likely to pitch them themselves than people who aren't. And we end up seeing kind of the existing structures of racism and sexism in our society replicated in this as well. Beyond that, there's a question of the kind of academic structures and university incentives that are in place. So in universities, the typical kind of progression, once you've done your PhD and maybe some time postdocing or lecturing, you get into an assistant professor role. In those first few years, that's where you're really showing to your university that you have value, that they should give you tenure and keep you forever. And what happens is these incentive structures for getting tenure are really focused on academic publications in academic journals and university presses, and they are less focused on what is still a crucial part of research, knowledge mobilization. And explanatory journalism and policy engagement is considered knowledge mobilization. It's once you've collected all your data and come up with new information that pushes knowledge, it's making sure that people who could make use of that new knowledge actually have access to it. And so in this case, policymakers are the ones we want to give access to our new knowledge. And so if you are pre-tenure, you're seeing that your university and your likely evaluators for your tenure application They are not paying attention to this. So you spend less time and energy writing those kinds of things up. You don't develop the skills necessarily to get good at creating that knowledge mobilization, that explanatory journalism, that policy impact. And the people who are already on the inside circle continue to gain noticeability and they continue to practice those skills. And so both of these are kind of like spirals in opposite directions, which just widens the gap. And then there's kind of layers onto those kind of base structures that apply across the board. So something like, if you can communicate really clearly in English in the Canadian context, you usually have a better shot at getting to that inside circle, because so many of the civil society groups and even policymakers are English as a first language. And if you are somebody who is physically based in Ottawa or near Ottawa, you are more likely to get called in. Maybe the pandemic is changing things because we're more used to doing visual or virtual rather activities. But for a long time, it's like CBC would rather have somebody in person. So if you can get to one of the CBC posts in downtown Ottawa or Toronto or Montreal, you had a better shot. Similarly, government briefings, they would like to have people in person. Sometimes they can fly experts in, but a lot of the times that's not really feasible. And it's not great for an academic to be like, all right, I wrote this explanatory journalism piece. Now I'm being invited to go to Ottawa. Okay, I'm going to get on a 5-hour flight to do it from BC. Like, that's not ideal for a 1-hour briefing most of the time. So there's those different levels that all play into who gets invited into the inner circle and who doesn't. And then that inner circle, once you're in it, you just keep spiraling up to more and more invites. And if you remain out of it, you never gain the skills or visibility that you need to jump in.
Right. Now, as a follow-up to that, Sabrina, maybe you can talk about some of what the key skills that academics need to develop and learn to produce compelling explanatory journalism.
Yeah. So, Evangeline, I'm sure you'll have to let me know if I missed anything, because of course this is an area I'm sure you have a lot of ideas on. But for me, kind of what comes to mind is, developing the skills to pitch, developing the skills to write very clear prose, and engaging with audiences. So with respect to pitching, right, that's actually the idea of very concisely and clearly in whatever 100 words, being able to sell the idea for the article, the op-ed, the piece of explanatory journalism that you would like to write. So you very clearly need to articulate what it is you're going to do, how you're going to do it, if you're in some cases, let's say speaking to other sources, but and finally emphasizing the impact, the value. Why is this important? And this isn't something that we're trained to do in academia. Sure, we write abstracts, but that's a bit of a different beast. And I think kind of making that sort of concise pitch is something that would be really valuable, whether it's in workshops or whether it's in other forms of training for many academics and doctoral students and postdocs to learn as well. With respect to writing clear prose, I think I can say this safely, is that academics are not necessarily often known for, being very clear and accessible writers, right? Like, people aren't necessarily picking up an academic book or a peer-reviewed journal article to, casually read after dinner. These are widely viewed as, well, and they're often behind paywalls, which is a whole other kettle of fish as well. But these articles, these publications, these materials are often, written for people who are already in that respective circle, people who are already within that discipline, who kind of understand the norms, understand the existing literature. They're not written for mainstream audiences, despite the fact that hopefully, a lot of this research is intended to positively impact the public. So I think there are kind of a lot of issues going on there, but the point is learning how to kind of take something from an academic context and kind of rewriting it and making it clear and accessible to the general public. is an important part of writing accessible explanatory journalism, and I would argue an important part of, engaging with the public, with the people whom we, in many ways hope to serve, or whose lives we hope to improve in academia. And finally, with respect to engaging with audiences, when one writes a piece for policy options or the conversation, these can strike really meaningful, provocative, thoughtful conversations, right? Whether they are on, via a Twitter thread, whether they are in a comment section or through a variety of other means. And I think that's also something that, academics aren't necessarily trained to do, is to actually, engage with people who are reading their work, to actually engage with people, who are civilly debating their ideas or their perspectives, etc. So I think, really kind of developing workshops or training programs or whatever else it may be in universities to better prepare academics as well as kind of emerging scholars to develop these skills would be very important.
Yeah, it's interesting you talk about the ability to pitch properly. I would say that at Policy Options, and even when I worked at the Gazette and worked in the opinion pages, I would say that the vast majority of things that arrive as submissions are fully written, so we have a chance to judge them on how, the accessibility of the writing and whether the premise is stated high up and sort of supported in a way that's accessible and in a different kind of writing. So yeah, that's interesting. So we're going to move to the Q&A session now for the rest of our hour. And let's see, we have one question that I'll put to the group, and you can decide which one of you would like to respond. In relation to the small independent news outlets and journalists, is their information being purposely buried by a lack of user engagement and Google advertisement placement, which is placing outlets who pay at the top of the news page? Or is it a mix of both, or are there other factors? Who would like to take that on?
Elizabeth, do you want to keep going with that? I'll maybe just say very briefly from the survey we did of other countries that it's also not possible to give you a blanket answer that applies to all places, because it actually is now starting to very much depend where you are located and what sorts of agreements there are that have been pushed through regulation by governments, for example. So whether it is in Australia, or there have been deals with the French government around Google paying quite a lot of money to news outlets, or even older standing debates around what was called the Leistungsschutzrecht, or the ancillary copyright law in Germany, which was supposed to get outlets to be paid for snippets of news that appear. But anyway, the point is really that actually the type of placement and the amount of money that each outlet may be making from it is starting to splinter in different ways. And what is happening in Canada is certainly that policymakers are looking at other places like Australia and France to see whether what is being colloquially known as a link tax is something that should be implemented within Canada. So I basically say there's no one concrete answer, because it's really starting to depend on what is happening in terms of regulation in different countries. And that's what makes this an interesting thing to study. But then maybe also that there's a lot that we don't know from the inside of how companies are actually creating discoverability algorithms. So there's we can say what we think is happening, but there's a lot more going on inside those algorithms that we frankly don't know about, which is also a problem for the transparency of making regulation around this arena.
Right. Which of the risks raised in the report do you think pose the biggest challenge to explanatory journalism publishers? Sabrina, maybe you want to take that one?
Sure. So I don't know if this poses the biggest risk necessarily, but I think a significant one is discoverability, which Elizabeth was talking about earlier. I think a piece of explanatory journalism, a piece of content has to actually be found and read for it to have any impact. So I think, you know, there's a lot of questions to be raised in that regard. And I should say discoverability, of course, refers to the extent to which, in this case, you know, a piece of content might be available via a search engine, an app, variety of other types of methods. Yeah, and I think, you know, in particular, my key concern around issues of discoverability is related to the lack of transparency, the lack of clarity around how, you know, search engines like Google per se organize and catalog content. We have a very limited understanding of how these processes take place, which I think means that, you know, there are ways to kind of remedy such concerns are therefore kind of challenged. So anyways, for me, discoverability is something that comes to mind, but I'd be interested to know, Elizabeth and Heidi, if there's anything else that you flag.
So, I mean, building off of what you've just said and connecting to a question that just showed up in the chat about, you know, reprinting being a striking feature of the Conversation Canada, and this idea of reprinting or republishing, of creating content that is licensed under Creative Commons licensing for others to use in whatever new context they want. I think that's a really crucial part of this conversation too, because when we think about discoverability of different pieces of content or different ideas, the more different online spaces in which that content or those ideas show up, the more likely it is that that information is then accessible and discoverable to different groups of people. Because one of the important parts of discoverability is that discoverability is not just a blanket, it is discoverable or it isn't to everyone. Discoverability is relative to the ways in which each individual makes use of different digital media and the ways in which each individual interacts with the content that shows up on their screen, right? Some people read an article, see a link, hop down the link. They're reading the article that was linked to, and now they've clicked on another link and they go into this, you know, link hole. They're deep in the rabbit hole, and that's how they really like engaging with information. Other people are like, oh, a link, fine, ignore, continue, right? And so these different ways we interact, I think, matters a lot. And so when republishing can happen and you can start seeing this content show up in a lot of different places, which might reach people who like to interact with their information differently, which might reach people who would have different media diets themselves, it means that those ideas can be accessed by larger communities, which then offers more opportunity for debate and discussion and validation or critique. It also offers more opportunities for policymakers and those around them to decide, okay, this is bubbling up in a few places, I really should pay attention to it, or I only saw it the one time, maybe it's a kind of out there idea, I don't need to pay attention to it. So I think that comes into play. That said, there's a few other aspects of reprinting and republishing kind of on the kind of technical and legislation side that maybe Heidi wants to jump in on.
Yeah, and I'd maybe just give one concrete example of how actually reprinting can lead to more discoverability. So once upon a time, I wrote a piece about the history of journalism for The Conversation, the one based in the US. And for some reason, it got reprinted by an Indian publication called The Wire. And all of a sudden, it had several 100,000 people who were reading it. But then that in turn led to greater discoverability in other places because it was so popular in one place, it was popping up in other people's feeds. So what reprinting can do is also give something new life. So it can actually mean that, as Elizabeth said, it bubbles up. It can bubble up in different places, but also it can increase the chance that it will show up high on something like Google News, which in terms of its search engine, there are many different features of search algorithms, but one of them is how many times something is linked to. So the more that something gets reprinted, the likelier it is to show up higher on somebody else's feed when they search for that particular topic. And I would also maybe just to answer, seeing as we're already on the topic of reprinting, Jean Allen's question. So yes, free reprinting is a striking feature of the Conversation Canada. And this is a bit where history comes into it, because there's got to be legislative structures that allow for that. And the structures that allow for that in the case of the Conversation Canada are Creative Commons licenses, which emerged over the last sort of 20 years. But there's a much bigger and longer history that we delve into in the report of the question of intellectual property rights in news. So are you or are you not allowed to reprint news articles or explanatory journalism? Is there a form of copyright that the authors hold? And this has changed over time in different ways that we delve into a little bit in the report, and say, you know, what is happening now, these debates around link tax, etc., they're often presented as completely unprecedented, but they actually build on at least a century and a half of debates about whether news and different forms of journalism are something that can be protected by intellectual property rights. And there have been lots of arguments over this. It has differed depending on which place you find yourself in. So it raises a whole host of questions as to who is pushing for these types of legislative solutions and what that might mean. The other sorts of things that reprinting raises are just even questions about trying to understand who is interested in this type of journalism. And that's something that Alf Hamida and Marilyn Young are looking into a lot more. So who's actually doing the reprinting and why? How do we assess that? What does it mean? These are all sorts of things that are quite important and striking. The other sorts of things I think are interesting to think about are how does it actually create a greater international audience for explanatory journalism that is actually originally written for a Canadian audience, but then is getting reprinted in the United States, in France, in India, et cetera, et cetera. It raises all sorts of new questions about what happens when a piece of explanatory journalism written for one place then suddenly goes to another. And then finally, it also raises questions if it gets translated of the quality of the translation and whether it is a bad translation, something that has plagued lots of places in Canada for at least 30 years that we talk about as well. So that's what we do in the report, is think a little bit more about what's the history of reprinting, what's the international context, and then what are some potential issues that both media outlets and policymakers should think about in this regard.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Now, we have another question, a comment, and a question. So I like the idea of looking at the life cycle of explanatory journalism. Part of it is that researchers want to publish a piece when their research is done, and policymaking certainly has a life cycle too. Policymakers need input on particular issues at particular times, and information on the issue that comes outside that window is mostly noise. So should more be done to line up explanatory journalism and policy making cycles? And if so, what? Sabrina, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, so I think that's a fantastic and really interesting question. So I don't know if I have a super clear answer right now, but I'll kind of ramble a bit, and then Heidi and Elizabeth can jump in and fill in the gaps. But I think that's exactly, I think it's a fantastic point. You know, when we're looking at the policy development cycle, let's say, I think you could kind of look at it in like 4 different phases. There's kind of the period when a policy issue is kind of being identified, it's coming to the fore as something that, you know, is of interest. There's sort of often, you know, there's a consultation phase. The government might ask for interventions from interested stakeholders. Then there's sort of a decision that's being made at some point, and then there's kind of a policy impact space afterwards. So, you know, to the question of should more be done to line up explanatory journalism and policymaking cycles? Yeah, I think it might be, you know, about thinking carefully as an author of explanatory journalism when a piece might have the most impact, or what angle one should take at a given point in that policy making cycle. So it's not necessarily as though one doesn't want to write about an issue at a given time per se, but perhaps, you know, when an issue is coming to the fore, when, you know, we know there are whispers that a bill is going to be tabled, etc., that might be a time to, you know, really actively put forward certain policy proposals and policy recommendations that can help kind of set the agenda, let's say. So that might kind of be a period when, you know, pieces with that particular aim might be written around a different policy issue. And during the period of consultation, you know, it might be about using explanatory journalism to go alongside a longer policy intervention that can, you know, serve as sort of a gate into that longer policy intervention that's being submitted to a government consultation, is writing an associated piece of explanatory journalism. So those are just kind of a couple examples of, I think, different angles or different approaches that can be used when writing explanatory journalism at different points in the policymaking cycle, at least.
Yeah, I would say timing is a huge factor in what we look for and what we choose. You know, we're always keeping our eye out at policy options on what's happening in terms of government decisions about to be made or just made, and obviously we give priority to pieces that talk about something that's happening in the news. So yes, what else do we have here? Another question, theoretically. The journalist editors at the conversation are keeping the journalistic value of timeless in mind. No, yes, exactly. So I'll speak for the conversation here and say that I'm sure as fellow editors, they are definitely keeping timeliness and timing in mind when they're choosing what to write and who to look for to write things. That's all part of what makes things, what gives things a news value, which is part of the equation in any kind of journalism, including explanatory. I would say probably timing is probably particularly important for explanatory journalism. Let's see, we have about 5 minutes left, so we'll go through a few more questions here. Heidi, what's one of the key things that history teaches about the risks facing explanatory journalism today?
Yeah, thanks. So, I mean, one of the key things is we're not facing completely new challenges here. And so that, I think, is just a helpful context to set that the internet is not the first technology that is presenting some of these challenges, including some of the challenges around the business structures of news organizations, and that some of the techniques we see, like legislative options, are ones that have been tried before in different ways, and sometimes successfully, sometimes unsuccessfully. And the other thing that we can also see is, are there different types of policy making options that have been tried before successfully or unsuccessfully? So I think those are a couple of the things we can see. And then even more basically, we looked at things like previous legal cases. So we found, for example, and this was Lucia's work, a case that was around a freelancer who sued the Globe and Mail because the Globe and Mail had taken the original articles, which had been in print, and then they put them into sort of CD-ROM-like formats. And the freelancer argued that this was violating the original agreements, and actually was awarded $11 million. So some of what we talk about in this report is actually very expensive and very worthwhile for outlets and policymakers to think about. And that's some of what we can learn from this history, right, of prior transitions with different technologies. They've actually presented some quite similar issues in different ways, that one then being about the afterlife of these pieces. And I just add that that's particularly important for something like explanatory journalism. So we just talked about its timeliness, but actually one of the features of explanatory journalism is that these pieces often have long afterlives. So policy issues spike up, but they don't necessarily go away. They can come back. And so the question of how we store these pieces, ensure there isn't link rot, etc. They're actually very live and important questions for this genre. So history basically gives us a sense of what is and isn't unprecedented, what solutions have been tried before, and what are some issues that we need to think about that often aren't raised when we just think about this through a contemporary lens.
Great, thanks, Heidi. Elizabeth, I'm going to put this question to you. We know that women and racialized people face a disproportionate amount of harassment online. What are the implications for effective knowledge mobilization in their case?
This is a really important question, because we know that, you know, it's not just about creating information that then is shared online. Often when we're thinking about the policy impacts, we realize that these authors are creating the content, it's getting shared, but then their name is tied to it. And it's their name that then gets recognized and begets further policy implications, right? This kind of goes back to the how do you get to the inside circle. And the thing is, if you kind of make that foray and then all of a sudden you get all kinds of hate back, you're going to be less likely to continue to participate in that conversation for the most part. And there are online strategies that sometimes get used by internet trolls or by people who don't like a particular perspective or a particular opinion or a particular kind of research, who will mobilize together in order to throw a whole bunch of energy at a dedicated moment in time towards trying to silence a given individual. And that can be completely overwhelming and completely traumatizing, frankly. And that can then mean that there are people who are less likely to be voluntarily joining that conversation. And so these online spaces can really disincentivize participation in public knowledge mobilization for academics, particularly when we go back to that fact that a lot of universities just are not valuing this kind of interaction. And so if you're saying, look, I'm doing this basically pro bono because I'm not getting professional credit for it, and then I'm getting attacked all of the time, it's hard to make the case for why your time and energy should be spent on that.
Yeah, that is so true. I wish we had more time to talk about all of these things, but we are at time now. So I will just take this opportunity to thank everybody for being here to listen to this important topic. And thanks, Sabrina, Heidi, Elizabeth, for walking us through some of the challenges that go along with this kind of journalism. Everybody, don't forget, you can download the report. The link is there, and there's also a link to the Global Journalism Innovation Lab projects there for you if you're curious about more on that. And thank you very much, everybody, for being here today. So, thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.